Nobody is born with shame. The paradox that he's making is that trying to control or eliminate shame actually reinforces it. Hello everyone, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you here. Today we're going to talk about shame. There are a number of people who've dedicated much of their work on this topic, such as Brené Brown or John Bradshaw. Today I want to talk about someone who is not extremely well known in the mainstream media, someone who wrote a book that almost nobody talks about, not enough at least, in my opinion. And that book is Perfect Pain, Perfect Shame by Jerry Duvinsky. The author is also really not afraid of letting his personality show on the page, which I really find endearing and I respect. He also seems to be inhabited by values I share. He understands that not everyone has the money or the time, for that matter, to be in therapy. So he offers some techniques and exercises in the book you can do on your own, but he's clear that they're not appropriate for just everyone, and that for some people, this kind of work really needs the support of a professional alongside. So I'm not going to talk about those techniques, I'm not going to give advice, I'm not a psychologist. But I'd like to talk to you today about what shame is, how it installs itself in us, how it expresses itself in sometimes unusual ways, and how trying to control it actually reinforces it. We're going to start with what is shame. So the way most people think of shame is of an emotion that rises with a specific trigger and fades when the trigger is gone or that enough time has passed. Duvinsky, so the author, is interested in something else, in shame as a trait. He thinks of it as durable, chronic, and something that overwhelms ourselves and becomes a sort of layer, a sort of filter in our life. A lot of people talk about it as toxic shame, which is a term coined by John Bradshaw. It's more of the term of pop psychology, toxic shame. But Duvinsky prefers his own term, which is core shame identity. Why this term? So as I said a little bit before, because in his view, this isn't something you feel. So it's not necessarily an emotion. It's something that you are. There's no separation between the experience and the person experiencing it. So the person becomes shame because shame is integrated into the personality, core shame identity. So how does it feel like in plain words? It's a persistent, vague sense of just being and feeling not okay as you are. So not pretty enough, not thin enough, rich enough, capable enough. You get the picture. The assumption underneath that is that if I had more of what I'm missing, of what I feel I'm missing, I'd finally be enough. But of course, it's a thirst that is unquenchable. Nothing really fills it. So Duvinsky also makes a distinction between guilt and shame. And he says, and I'm quoting from him, "We feel guilt on the basis of what we do and experience shame because of what we are." So the guilt is I did something bad, and shame, I am bad. So as I said earlier, the paradox that he's making is that trying to control or eliminate shame actually reinforces it. So the very act of trying to fix the thing confirms the underlying belief, which is that I'm broken, I need to be repaired. He also makes a very important point that, and I'm quoting from him again, nobody is born with shame. We are born with no sense of self at all. He says that shame is actually learned. through the messages that we internalize in childhood. Biology contributes as well. Some nervous systems are more sensitive than others, but conditioning is really primary. But there's also a good thing in all of this, is that what is learned can be unlearned. Essentially, what was conditioned can be deconditioned, then reconditioned into something that feels more authentic to you. But doing that is actually a long process, and it's not really easy. So one of the most striking ideas in this book is that the voice of shame, self-critique, it's actually not your voice in the first place. When Duvinsky asked all his patients to identify the voice, they identified them as their own voice. And so his point is that since they weren't born with shame, that voice had to come from somewhere else. So often it's from one or both parents. It can also be from siblings, from a former partner, an ex. It can also be from caregivers or a significant other person in your life. So where does this all begin in a child? So Duvinsky talks about Allan Schore. He was a neuropsychologist who has spent his career studying how the brain develops in the context of early attachment. So this person proposed a model of how shame is physiologically imprinted in a child. And he describes a scene of his work. A young child reuniting with a parent after a brief absence. The child is in a state of high excitement. His or her sympathetic nervous system fires up, anticipating connection. If the parent does not match that effect, if they're cold, distracted, dismissive, the child experiences a sudden affective misattunement. And this triggers what Schore calls a stress shock-induced deflation. The child withdraws, and he believes it's the physiological imprint of shame. Shame comes about, Duvinsky writes, when attachment bonds are in some manner threatened, inconsistent, or ambiguous. So how can we express shame? Duvinsky says that there are things that are said. So he gives a list in the book of phrases his patients have repeated to him over the years, things they heard from parents. So things like, you'd be much prettier if you lost 5 pounds. We never had these problems with your sister. You shouldn't feel that way. That's crazy. Stop your crying. Your brother was a natural athlete. So that kind of sentences. And of course, these messages impact people, especially if they are repeated, they leave a trace. But he also talks about the things that aren't said, and that actually they are equally damaging. And I'd like to quote a passage. He says, "It is also extremely important to recognize that perhaps the greatest amount of shame is generated by what isn't said and done. The absence or lack of praise, I love yous, empathetic and validating statements, or affectionate physical gestures serves as a powerful transmission of shame. In no uncertain manners, it conveys the message that one is not loved or lovable or generally not okay." So many people who carry a lot of shame in them never experienced any obvious cruelty, any abuse, any moment they could point and say, that's where it all began. So it can feel very isolating, and this general feeling of not knowing where to point your finger on. The author says, all these messages over time form an aggregate message that can resonate throughout lifespan in one's central nervous system. I'm quoting again here. The wall is erected to form a protective defense against the pain of being seen as we are. but therefore long we become prisoners within our own ramparts, leading to increased feelings of alienation, isolation, and despair. There's also a passage I love in the book because you really grasp the absurdity of it. I'm just going to read it and you'll see. A little kid will never have the following conversation in their head. It's a shame that mom and dad are byproducts of dysfunctional family conditions in their own childhoods. Their behavior towards me is a byproduct of their unconscious reactivity to unfortuitous conditioning events that took place in their own lives. I am quite certain that this conversation has never taken place in a child's head. On the contrary, children blame themselves for the negative circumstances that occur in their lives. They learn to feel that if I was bigger, stronger, smarter, prettier, or whatever, then such things would not occur. The child learns that their lack of acceptance by their parents must be a function of their own unworthiness. So yeah, no child has this kind of thinking, obviously, because they are not mature enough in the sense that they know less about the world to think in those terms. As children, we develop a lot of protective mechanisms in order to survive in life and to make sense of the world. Because to hold so much uncertainty of my parents are flawed and there's nothing I can do about it is really difficult. So it's easier to actually tell yourself the story that it's your fault rather than being left with the despair and the helplessness that your parents may not be as steady as you think they are. Because that threatens your whole sense of safety, your sense of security. A lot of parents pass forward what was done or said to them, not because they're cruel by essence, but because they think that it's the way to deal with these situations, because that's how they were treated when they were young, and sometimes even with good intentions. One can just pass on what has been done or said to them, even unconsciously. What can stop this intergenerational cycle is if someone tries to question what has happened to them and what the consequences of these actions or words were. I'm not saying that you will automatically repeat what was done or said to you, but there's a higher chance that if you acknowledge the pain that you've been through when these things happened, then you will choose to make different decisions with your own children, for example. Now, how does shame actually shows up in life? And let's start with a quote from Jerry Duvinsky himself. So, in all manners, shame compels us to hide. So here are the different forms of hiding. So creating a sort of chameleon behavior that you adapt your personality depending on who you are with. A false persona. A refusal to be expressive, so not expressing your real thoughts, feelings, or real needs. Lying or storytelling, embellishing the image, for example. So the inability to let go. A general fear of losing control, body shame, but also humor as hiding, because sometimes it's easier. Duvinsky has a line that I find quite striking, that being the funny one keeps people liking you, but it also lets you hide in plain sight. He wonders aloud, and I think this is worth noting, that whether some of the great comics like Robin Williams, Richard Pryor, became prisoners of their own defense mechanisms. A lot of people who are shame-based become self-deprecating, submissive, people-pleasing, etc. But for some, they show the exact opposite: self-confidence, competitiveness, entitlement. Often are unaware of their own shame, are very reluctant to take responsibility for their mistakes. So he says, even the narcissists are, at their core, victims of shame. So shame can be disguised as pride, because asking for help would risk being seen as imperfect, incapable, needy, so they struggle in silence. They never really delegate, or they have really a hard time to reach out. So it looks like pride, but essentially it's shame. This big struggle of receiving can fuel patterns of codependency, which express itself as the belief that you have value only when you're being needed. Of course, it's a continuum. Like, we all feel pride sometimes, and we all feel embarrassed in some social situations, for example. I think it's things that make us human. It's all a question of degrees and how insidious it is. So this book really helped me think about shame as something that's conditioned. I cannot speak from experience, but I know watching my brothers and sisters with their children that it's really not an easy road. I personally wanted to be a better aunt for my niece and my nephew. And I think that this book, alongside many others, has really helped me impact positively our relationship. So I'd like to leave you with two things before this episode ends. The next time that you feel that you're talking to yourself in your head in a very critical way, to try to pause and just asking yourself, where does it come from? Because again, nobody is born with shame. It gets conditioned. It can be like a societal norm that we've been conditioned to learn. So just, I think, noticing the source can really help and be a good step. And I'd like to leave you with a question of something that you could think of. If you were completely free from shame, what are all the things that you would do? Thank you so much for listening all the way through. The book, again, is Perfect Pain, Perfect Shame, A Journey into Radical Presence by Jerry Duvinsky.